What if the biggest clue to your Irish ancestry isn't hidden inside a DNA test result, but inside your surname, your family's traditions, the county your ancestors came from, or even the stories your grandparents once told by the fire? Millions of people around the world may have Irish roots without ever realizing it. Some clues have survived for centuries, written into the land and the language. Others have been hiding in plain sight, in the everyday words we still use and the names we still pass down. Today we're going to uncover 15 of them, but before we begin, an honest warning. These signs are not proof, they are clues. One clue means little. A surname can be shared by strangers with no blood tie. A family story can be reshaped by 100 retellings. Even your DNA can whisper a story that contradicts the one your family has told 4 generations. What historians, genealogists, linguists, and geneticists do instead is something more patient. They gather clues, they weigh them against each other. They let one piece of evidence sharpen another until a faint picture begins to emerge from the dark. One clue means little, several together become much more meaningful. So as we walk through these 15 signs, treat each one not as a verdict, but as a small lamp lighting a corner of a very large and very old room dot. And if you'd like to play along, drop your surname, your country, and the county your family came from in the comments below. You might be surprised how many people share a clue you thought was yours alone. The first sign is the one you've been carrying your whole life without thinking about it: your surname. Irish surnames are among the oldest in Europe, older than most English surnames, older than many of the countries they travelled to. The classic Irish surname begins with Y, meaning descendant of, or Mac, meaning son of. Y Brian, Mac Carthy, Y Neil, Mac Mathana. Under pressure from English and English-speaking clerks, these names were anglicised over the centuries, sometimes gently, sometimes brutally. Y Brian became a Brian, Mac Carthy became a Carthy. Y Neil became O'Neill, Mac Mathana became McMahon. Picture an Irish-speaking grandfather standing before an English-speaking clerk in a county office, spelling a name his family had used for 1,000 years, and watching the clerk write down whatever he thought he heard. Some names lost their Y and Mac entirely: Brian, McCarthy, Neil. Others were translated outright. Mac and Goyle, meaning son of the foreigner, became Gallagher in some records and Gaul in others. None of this proves your ancestors were Irish. A surname is a word, not a bloodline. But it can preserve a thread of language that survived for 1,000 years, because ordinary people refused to stop using it. And sometimes, that stubborn survival is itself the most Irish thing about you. Which raises a question worth holding in your mind: why do millions of Irish descendants no longer have Irish surnames? The answer is that names were changed, shortened, translated, and sometimes simply invented at the dock, when a clerk could not spell what he heard. The second sign is older than your surname, and often older than your country, the county your family came from. Ireland has 32 counties, divided into 4 ancient provinces: Leinster, Munster, Connaught, and Ulster. Each one has its own history, its own accents, its own patterns of settlement and migration. If your known ancestors came from a particular county, you were standing on ground that was deeply shaped by centuries of Gaelic families, Norman arrivals, plantations, and diaspora. Of course, people move constantly. The Norman invasion, the plantations, the penal laws, the Great Famine, and the Great Migrations to America, Britain, Australia, and Canada scattered families far from their ancestral homes. But county roots still matter, because the deeper your family ties to a single Irish county, the more likely that older layers of settlement are part of your story. Why are some counties far more common in family trees than others? Often it comes down to which counties lost the most people during the famine, and which ports saw the most departures. Cork, Kerry, Galway, Mayo, and Donegal appear again and again in overseas family trees, because those were the counties that bled the most in the 1840s. The third sign is one almost everyone overlooks: the place names around your family's homeland. While the great houses and estates were renamed by their new owners, ordinary villages and townlands kept their old names through sheer inertia. The ending Bally, from Bailey, means a homestead or town, as in Ballymena or Ballyshannon. The ending Knock, from Cianoch, means a hill, as in Knock or Knockregery. The ending Kill, from Cell, means a church, as in Kilkenny or Kildare. The ending rath means a ringfort, and dun means a fort, as in Dundalk or Dunlowghair. The ending more, from more, means big, and beg, from big, means small. So you find place names like Drumbeg and Drumore side by side. These names survive because they were useful. People needed to know where the church was, where the hill stood, where the homestead lay. The names outlasted the people who made them, and they surround millions of us today. If the townlands within a day's walk of where your family lived are thick with these endings, you are walking through a linguistic landscape laid down more than 1500 years ago, and yet most of us drive through it every day without ever hearing what it is saying. The fourth sign is older than the counties, and older than the place names, the ancient Gaelic clans. Long before Ireland had counties, it had Tuatha, kingship groups, led by a chieftain, and these Tuatha eventually grew into the great Gaelic families that ruled Ireland for centuries. The O'Neills of Ulster, the O'Briens of Thomond, the O'Connors of Connaught, the McCarthys of Desmond, the Kavanaghs of Leinster. Each of these clans held a territory, claimed a common ancestor, and kept a genealogy that was recited orally by professional historians. If your surname links you to one of these clans, you are connected to a lineage that was already old when the Normans arrived in 1169. Picture a chieftain's hall in the year 1000, the fire burning in the center of the room, the poet reciting the family's ancestors back through 14 generations, to a man whose name you still carry today. Which clue surprises professional genealogists most? Many will tell you it is the clan genealogy. They have learned that the oldest evidence is often not the parish register, but the oral lineage, kept alive by a professional class of historians, whose job was to remember. The fifth sign is the softest and the most easily dismissed, family oral traditions. A grandparent's claim that the family came from Ireland, that there was once a great-great-grandmother who never spoke English, or that the family was once or something before the name was shortened at the dock, may sound like fantasy. But oral history often carries a small kernel of real memory inside layers of storytelling. Imagine your great-grandmother at a kitchen table, her hands dusted with flour, telling a child that the bread they were shaping came from her own mother's village, a place she could no longer find on any map. Names of forgotten townlands, recipes for breads nobody else seems to make, songs in a language nobody in the family can translate, superstitions about the fairies and the holy wells, even a stubborn family habit of burying the dead facing a certain direction. None of these prove Irish ancestry, but they are clues the written records ignore, and they sometimes point toward a truth the family felt long before any genealogist could prove it. The wise genealogist listens to the story, writes it down, and then goes looking for the paper that confirms or corrects it. The sixth sign sits in archives that most people never visit, Catholic parish records. From the late 18th century onwards, Catholic parishes across Ireland began keeping baptism and marriage registers, and many of these survive today. These records can carry a family line back 2 or 3 generations further than civil registration, which only began in 1864. Picture the scene: a parish priest in a small stone church, dipping his pen into ink, recording the baptism of a child whose parents could not write their own names, who would never imagine that 200 years later someone would be searching his pages for a name that might be theirs. If your family's county and parish records survive, you can often trace a line back to the very edge of living memory, where the written record gives way to the oral genealogy. This is where many Irish family journeys begin, and where many of them, frustratingly, end. The records of the Public Record Office in Dublin, destroyed in 1922, took with them centuries of wills, censuses, and church records that would have answered thousands of family questions. The seventh sign is hidden in the names your family still chooses, Irish first names. Patrick, Bridget, Sean, Kathleen, Kevin, Brendan, Maeve, Niamh, Aoife, Sheen. Each of these names carries a root deep in the Irish language. Patrick, of course, honours the patron saint, but Patrick himself was not Irish. He was a Briton taken to Ireland as a slave. Bridget comes from Brigid, an older goddess Christianized as St. Brigid. Sean is the Irish form of John. Kathleen and Kevin are anglicised forms of Caitlin and Coimhin. When a family passes the name Bridget or Patrick down through 5 generations, they may be honouring a tradition older than they realise, a tradition that survived poverty, famine, and emigration by hiding inside the family rather than the church. The eighth sign is the one everyone wants to talk about, and the one that needs the most careful handling. DNA, genetic ancestry testing, has opened a door that earlier generations of genealogists could only dream of, but it is not a magic mirror. Most commercial tests estimate broad ancestry components from reference populations, and they will often show a percentage labeled something like Irish, Scottish, or Gaelic. That label can suggest Irish ancestry, but it cannot prove a specific ancestor. The Irish population, like every population, is the product of waves of migration: prehistoric farmers, Bronze Age metalworkers, Gaels, Vikings, Normans, Scots, and English. Modern genetic studies, including large-scale work on ancient DNA from Irish burial sites, suggest that the western seaboard retains a particularly strong signal of older Irish ancestry, while the east shows more mixing with Viking, Norman, and later British populations. But these are averages across populations, not verdicts on individuals. Your own DNA cannot be labeled Irish with absolute certainty, and any test that promises you a specific ancestor is selling you a story, not a result. Could your DNA disagree with your family stories? Yes, and often it does. A surname follows one line, the paternal line, while your genome is woven from hundreds of ancestors whose names are long forgotten. What DNA can do is add one more lamp to the room. When your genetic communities overlap with your county roots, your surname's linguistic roots, and your family's traditional first names, you have something much more interesting than any one of those clues alone. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Consider subscribing, because the second half of this list only gets more personal. The ninth sign follows the Irish, who crossed the Irish Sea other than the Atlantic. Migration to Britain. For centuries, Irish people moved to England, Scotland, and Wales in search of work, especially during the famine and the industrial decades that followed. By the mid-19th century, Liverpool, Glasgow, London, and Manchester had large Irish-born populations. Picture the dock at Liverpool in 1847. A young woman stepping off a starving ship with nothing but the clothes she wore and the name her father had carried before her, looking out at a city whose accent she could barely understand, carrying in her mouth the dialect words, the family stories, and the Irish first names that would quietly take root in a foreign street. She might have come from a Connaught village where the last words her mother spoke to her were in Irish, a language her own children would never learn. Many families in Britain today, who consider themselves entirely English or Scottish, may have an Irish grandmother or great-grandfather hiding in their tree. Sometimes forgotten within 2 generations, the Irish in Britain often vanished into the wider population faster than the Irish in America, where parishes and neighbourhoods kept the memory alive. If your family suddenly appears in an English or Scottish industrial city in the mid-19th century with an Irish-sounding name, you may be looking at the trace of one of the largest migrations in European history. The 10th sign follows the Irish, who crossed the Atlantic. Migration to America. From the colonial period onwards, Irish people sailed to North America, but the Great Wave came in the famine years and the decades that followed. By the end of the 19th century, millions of Americans could trace at least one line back to Ireland. Picture the dock at New York, a young man with nothing more than a wooden chest and the surname his grandfather had carried before him, looking back at the ship that had carried him across the Atlantic, carrying in his mouth the dialect words, the family stories, and the Irish first names that would land on a foreign shore and quietly take root. A family in Boston carrying the surname O'Connor, or a family in Chicago that still keeps a faded photograph of a great-grandmother in a shawl may be holding the far end of a thread that runs all the way back to a Carey farmstead. Consider a single named case. John F. Kennedy's great-grandfather left County Wexford during the famine, sailed to Boston, and his grandson's grandson became President of the United States. The migration was not a single wave, but a long, slow tide that has never truly stopped. The 11th sign is one of the most painful and the most revealing: famine records. The Great Famine of the 1840s transformed Irish family history. Over 1 million people died. Over 1 million more emigrated. Whole villages emptied. Records of the period are uneven, but they survive in fragments: workhouse registers, relief committee rolls, emigration lists, shipping records, and later the census substitutes that genealogists use to rebuild what was lost. If your family's trail goes cold in the 1840s, you were not alone. The famine took with it not only lives but records, names, and the threads that tied families to particular places. Sometimes a whole townland was emptied, and the only evidence that a family ever lived there is a single name and a relief list or a fragment of a workhouse ledger. But sometimes, a single entry in a workhouse register or a passenger list can carry a name across the ocean and back again, linking a forgotten village to a forgotten branch of your own family. The 12th sign is the boldest and the most often misunderstood. Ancient kingdoms. Long before Ireland was a single country, it was a patchwork of kingdoms, Tara, Cashel, Connaught, Gaelic, and many more. These kingdoms had their own dynasties, their own saints, their own laws, and their own rivalries. Picture a hilltop in the year 800, when a king could look out from his fort and see the smoke of a rival kingdom rising on the horizon, when a man riding 30 miles might pass through 3 different laws, 3 different accents, and 3 different loyalties. The great kingdom of Connaught produced queens like Meb, whose story was told in the Táin, Ireland's oldest epic. Munster had its own dynasty at Cashel. Ulster had the O'Neills of Tara. If your family roots run deep in one of these old heartlands, you were inheriting not just a place, but a regional identity that was forged in the early medieval centuries. A family from Kerry and a family from Donegal may both be Irish, but they may carry echoes of 2 very different ancient worlds. The Kingdom of Munster traced its kings to the Eoganachta, a dynasty that ruled from Cashel for centuries. Connaught claimed the Ui Breween. Ulster was held by the northern and southern Ui Neil, 2 branches of the same great family. These were not abstract territories on a map, but living communities, and their rivalries shaped the surnames, the saints, and the stories that survived into the modern world. Historians still argue about how much these kingdoms were political constructions and how much they were genuine cultural families. And the honest answer is that they were probably both. The 13th sign is one your grandparents may have carried in their mouths without knowing it. Celtic language clues. The Irish language, Gaelic, is a Celtic language, closely related to Scottish Gaelic and Manx, more distantly to Welsh, Breton, and Cornish. Even in families where the language was lost generations ago, traces survive. Words like galore, from Golior, meaning enough. Slogan, from Sua Game, meaning a battle cry. Smithereens, from Smithereeni, meaning little pieces. Banshee, from Bean Sea, meaning a fairy woman. Even the structure of how some families speak English, the rhythm, the storytelling, the way questions are answered with another question, can echo the lost language. Which clue almost everyone overlooks, this one. We are trained to look for records and names, and we forget that the lost language still walks around inside the mouths of the living. The 14th sign is hidden in what your ancestors did for a living, family occupations. Certain trades were common in particular regions of Ireland, and some surnames grew directly from those trades. The name Foley comes from the Irish for a plunderer. Highburn O'Norman names, like Archer and Butler, point to trades brought over with the Normans. A family tradition of linen weaving in Ulster, of fishing on the western seaboard, of small holding in Connaught, of smuggling along the wild coast of Cork, can all be clues to a family's regional origin. If your ancestors were tenant farmers, you may find them in land records, like Griffith's valuation, the Great Survey of 1847 to 1864 that listed every occupier of land in Ireland. Griffith's valuation is often the first firm record an Irish family researcher finds. The bridge between the famine era and the older, patchier records that came before. The 15th sign is the one we have been building toward all along, when several clues come together. A single surname is just a word, a single county is just a place. A single DNA percentage is just a number. But when your surname carries a Gaelic root, your family came from a particular Irish county. The townlands around them are thick with Bally and Kill endings. Your grandparents used words nobody else understood. The parish records carry your name back to the edge of the famine. Your DNA community maps onto that same region. And your family still passes down an Irish first name 3 generations deep. Those clues begin to reinforce each other. They don't add up to proof, they add up to something honest and far more interesting, a picture. And a picture, built patiently from any small lamps, is worth more than any single bright claim dot. So how do you actually begin to explore this for your own family? Start with what you know and work backwards, one generation at a time, and let each confirmed fact earn the next question. Parish records, passenger lists, civil records, and census returns can carry you back generation by generation. Griffith's valuation is often the first firm foothold for Irish research. Local history societies and county genealogy centres hold keys no online database has indexed. Old maps show you the landscape your ancestors walked. DNA tests can suggest broader ancestry communities you can compare against your paper trail. The goal is not to find one Irish ancestor. The goal is to build a picture, clue by clue, and to let the picture tell you the truth about your family rather than the story you hoped for. The truth is almost always more interesting. Perhaps the greatest inheritance your Irish ancestors left behind wasn't land, wealth, or a family castle. Most of them never had any of those. Perhaps it was a surname, a story, a memory, a tradition, a quiet connection that survived generations, that survived a famine, a crossing, and a new life in a country whose name they might never have imagined. And if today's clues inspire you to begin exploring your own family history, then those voices from centuries ago are still guiding you home. So tell us in the comments your surname, your county, your country, and which of these 15 signs surprised you most. And tell us what documentary you want us to make next, because the next story might be yours.